Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. We're going to try and get started on time since we only have an hour. My name is Anna Gzmagusa. I'm normally the director of the Europe Center, but today I get to play the role of Harold and have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you Jim Goldgeier, who's a visiting scholar here at CSAC and professor of international relations at American University, where he was also served as dean. In his very accomplished and distinguished career, Jim not only contributed to research and our understanding of critical security issues that affect America and Russia alike, just NATO, foreign policy, and multipolarity. He's also shaped policy as the visiting fellow at Brookings, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and director for the Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs in the National Security Council. He's currently a member of the Secretary of State for National Security Advisory Board and chairs the State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. Just as importantly, he's one of the key organizers of Bridging the Gap, an initiative that brings scholars to public policy debate, ensuring that a new and diverse set of scholarly voices will bring their expertise and experience into the policy world. And today, he will speak on his new book, NATO Enlargement, From Cold War Victory to Russia, Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Jim.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Thanks for moderating today, and thanks everybody for coming. And so grateful to CSAC. Here it is. I came for 6 months 2 years ago. So appreciate the hospitality and willingness of CSAC to have me here. And in the 2 years, have produced 2 books, which I'm just going to mention one because it's not the subject of today, but for people in this room who are online who are PhDs interested in non-academic careers, foreign policy careers for PhDs, Practical Guide to a World of Possibilities. I recommend it highly. What I want to do today with respect to this issue of NATO enlargement, I want to explain the origins of this project that resulted in the book I'll mention momentarily. I want to talk about how I think we should evaluate a policy like NATO enlargement. Basically, going to argue it's how we should evaluate any policy, but I don't think much of that has taken place with respect to this one in particular, but that is to look at the pros and cons of the policy and then compare those to the pros and cons of the main alternatives that could have been chosen, but were not. And then I want to close by explaining why I've come to support Ukrainian membership in NATO, why I believe it's the policy that would be most likely to contribute to stability and security in Europe over the long term, by mentioning the pros and cons of that approach compared to the pros and cons of others that are being discussed. But since that is not likely to happen, at least not anytime soon, I will talk about what I think the actual options are. So, origins of the project that I'm going to be discussing. 5 years ago, I think it was, January 2019, I had grown increasingly irritated by the debate over NATO enlargement, a subject which I've been studying for a long time. And the problem with the debate has largely been that it lacked all nuance. You had those who think policy is stupid and is the original sin that created all the problems in the US-Russia relationship, who were arguing precisely that. And then on the other side, people arguing that, it was greatest policy of all time. And, the Russians should have just accommodated themselves to it. And although I am sympathetic to the latter argument, my view is that, again, if you're going to argue about a policy, you've got to examine the pros and cons, and you've got to compare those to the pros and cons of the alternatives. And that wasn't me. So January 2019, I called someone I knew pretty well, Josh Shifrinson, who was then an assistant professor at Boston University, and said the debate stinks, and you and I are on opposite. We disagree about the wisdom of NATO enlargement. I knew that Josh was very opposed to NATO enlargement. And so I said, if we could work together, then maybe we could improve the debate. And Josh came up with the idea of a of bringing together, he had some funds at BU. He came up with the idea of bringing together a group of scholars to a conference later that spring with the idea of producing a special issue of a journal, which we did, special issue of international politics that came out in the summer of 2020. And it was great. We had 12 chapters. We had the framing chapter that Josh and I wrote, and then 11 other pieces from junior and senior scholars, historians, political scientists. And we then moved on from that to a piece that's actually the main part, the substantive part of my NATO discussion, the comparison of the alternatives. We did a piece for this book, Before and After the Wall, World Politics in the End of the Cold War, edited by the late Nuno Montero and Chris Bartel. And then in May of 2022, an editor from Palgrave Macmillan got in touch with us and said, you know, we own the journal International Politics. And do you think, in light of the war, the expanded war, and the desire of Finland and Sweden to join NATO, do you think that your authors would be willing to revise their pieces? And we could, if they got it done by fall, we could get the book out on the first anniversary of the expanded. And the authors all agreed, which was amazing. And then we added 4 new pieces to the original special issue. We had a piece by Vlad Zubak on the evolution of Russian foreign policy thinking. Vlad and I first met at CSAC in the late 80s, so that was good to have him in there. We had a piece on NATO China that we added by Norwegian scholar Lisa Odgaard. We had one on NATO Ukraine. We didn't have that in the special issue, so we added that to the book. And then former Pentagon official Jim Townsend did a piece sort of reflecting on the evolution of NATO during the time that he worked on it, and especially what it meant for Finland and Sweden to come in. And so we produced this monster, Evaluating NATO Enlargement from Cold War Victory to the Russia-Ukraine War. And the thing I'm most excited about, which was the appeal to us with Palgrave, is I hadn't really fully understood. They're owned by Springer, and most university libraries subscribe to Springer products. So faculty and students can download the book for free if the university library has a subscription. And there've been more than 16,000 downloads in the 11 months since the thing came out. So very hopefully it's contributing to the debate on NATO enlargement. And then one last piece of this project last summer, Steve Wertheim at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace was quite taken with the idea that Josh and I could actually work together. So he asked us to engage in a series of letters debating the topic of NATO enlargement. And so they created a page on the Carnegie Endowment website for that. That series of letters rehashing the 1990s and looking at the wisdom, or in Josh's case, the folly of wanting to bring Ukraine into NATO. And been really pleased to be able to do that. And actually, that was much easier because we were each writing our own letter. The harder thing was writing the framing piece and writing it together, where there was much negotiation that had to take place. So how to evaluate NATO enlargement? As I said, have to compare it to plausible alternative. And the reason that Josh and I are able to work together is that we agree on the pros and cons of enlargement, but we disagree on how to weight them. So we agree on how to evaluate the policy. We just disagree on what the wisdom, or again, in his case, folly of the policy is. So benefits and costs of the policy that was chosen. Benefits: created incentives for political and economic reform in Central and Eastern Europe, help pave the way for European Union enlargement, reduce security threats throughout the region by enhancing stability and security in Central and Eastern Europe. Germany's eastern border is no longer NATO's eastern border, which did a lot for that country's security concerns and perhaps obviated the need for Germany to pursue unilateral security policies. In terms of the costs, increase the military commitments and burdens for NATO, because you had new countries, of course, that were now covered by Article 5, the article that is at the heart of NATO, that treats an attack on one as an attack on all. Led to diverging threat perceptions within the alliance, now that you had such a diverse group of members, so that was certainly a challenge for a while, although more coherent since February of 2022, and contributed to the deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations. And, even as somebody who supports enlargement, it contributed to the deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations. And I'm happy to get into that more in Q&A in terms of comparison to other issues in the relationship. But so Josh and I agree on these costs and benefits. As I said, we weight them differently. I believe the enhancement of security and stability across Eastern Europe was significant, that the defense costs are manageable. And the key thing is, I don't believe U.S.-Russia relations would be markedly different in the absence of NATO enlargement. So for me, the benefits outweigh the cost. Josh thinks the opportunity was missed to develop a strong U.S.-Russia partnership. And he thinks that far outweighs any gains in Central and Eastern Europe from the standpoint of U.S. interests. And he also thinks the costs of defending Eastern Europe are too high from a U.S. standpoint. So he has consistently opposed. So how do we compare that policy chosen to the alternatives? I think importantly, we take as our starting point the U.S. decision to, at the end of the Cold War, to stay engaged in NATO and to view NATO as the central security mechanism in Europe as a key decision. It didn't have to be that way. Bush administration could have decided, and a lot of people were arguing, Warsaw Pact's gone, why should NATO still be around? And there was an explicit decision for NATO to remain, and especially because that meant the U.S. would continue to play the driving role in shaping European security. And it had huge consequences because it meant that other alternatives, like making the OSCE, what became the OSCE, the main security institution, or having the EU play the primary role in European security, were not real alternatives once the US made this decision about NATO with allied agreement. And so what Josh and I do in terms of thinking about plausible alternatives is to focus on what we call sort of NATO-centric alternatives, of which there are at least three that could have been chosen compared to the policy that we've had. One is to use the Partnership for Peace, which was established in January of 1994, which was designed as an alternative to enlargement, that NATO could have pursued the Partnership for Peace as that alternative to enlargement, or at least put enlargement off for a long time. Second was to invite Russia to join NATO, which may seem crazy, but I will discuss momentarily. Wasn't completely crazy. And the third was to pursue some of the enlargement that took place, but not as much as occurred. So let me go through these. So Partnership for Peace. The Partnership for Peace was developed by the Pentagon in 1993 as an alternative to enlargement due to two key concerns. One was the additional security guarantees to new countries that enlargement would entail at a time of a drawdown in the defense. From the Pentagon standpoint, okay, peace dividend, you're lowering the defense budget. Don't ask us to take on new Article 5 commitments. And the second, and particularly for the person for whom this room is named, was that enlargement would get in the way of U.S.-Russia arms control. And, certainly for Secretary Perry and others, Ash Carter, for example, lowering the number of nuclear weapons took precedence over everything else, and that they feared that NATO enlargement would get in the way. And it is worth noting that in the 8 years of the Clinton administration, there was not a nuclear arms control agreement. Partnership for Peace was a program that created military-to-military ties between NATO and all of the former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet states, and was designed to ensure that these militaries were on board with democratic reform. Partnership for Peace has provided major benefits to European security, even with it was superseded by NATO enlargement, but it still provided tremendous benefits. And but the major benefits of if Partnership for Peace had really been pursued as an alternative to enlargement, is that it would have given the Russians less reason to believe that the West remained hostile to it, thereby perhaps increasing the chances for partnership, and it would not have created new defense burdens for NATO. So, you know, there were certainly benefits there for NATO. The cost, keeping the desires of the Central and East Europeans to join NATO, and I think it's really important to remember these countries wanted to join. They weren't forced to join. It wasn't that the US said to these countries, you gotta join NATO. They were the ones that wanted to join NATO. And I think that keeping those desires at bay would have entailed both moral and political costs. It's not an accident that the big push from the Central and Eastern Europeans with the Clinton administration that had just come into office in January of 1993 came with the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in April, and the ties to, you know, the set of issues that museum addressed. NATO's Article 10 provide for NATO to be able to invite any European state to join that fulfills the principles of the alliance and contributes to alliance security. It's what enabled NATO to enlarge during the Cold War. Greece and Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1955, Spain in 1982, and the United Germany being a full member of NATO with unification in 1990. I think it would have been really hard for NATO to justify not responding to the interests of the Central and Eastern Europeans and joining, because a line had been drawn in the 1940s that wasn't relevant at the end of the Cold War. And I think it would have also had huge political costs. There certainly was perceived by President Clinton as having political costs if he didn't proceed, and I'm happy to discuss that further if you want. It's also the potential the Central and Eastern Europeans would not have been as successful at pursuing political and economic reforms if their populations didn't see that they were going to be able to join NATO as a result of those policies. And particularly if you believe, as I do, that NATO enlargement was the key to European Union enlargement. I'd be interested in your perspective on that. But I just think it would have been really hard for the EU to enlarge if NATO weren't enlarging as well because of the Article 5 guarantee. And I particularly believe that with respect to the Baltic countries joining. I don't see how the Baltic countries could have joined the European Union if they hadn't also come into NATO. All right. What about if NATO had invited Russia to join? This was an issue that was there on and off between 1991 and 2000. In December of 1991, NATO had a meeting of the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. This was the meeting of the former Warsaw Pact countries, Soviet Union, former Warsaw Pact countries, there to meet with NATO at the end of 1991. Very dramatic moment. The Soviet ambassador excused himself from the room, came back in and said, I no longer represent the Soviet Union. I now represent the Russian Federation, and my president, Boris Yeltsin, would like to join NATO. And, you know, occasionally NATO, Yeltsin would talk about, how, Russia should be able to join. And because of Article 10, and because Russia is a European country, the response of the Clinton administration throughout the 90s was, yes, if Russia continues to go in a democratic direction, it too could be eligible to join NATO. Al Gore raised this with Boris Yeltsin once I think, in fact, Yeltsin was even in the hospital at the time. But anyway, Gore was in Moscow. He met with Yeltsin late 1994 and, reminded him, Russia could join NATO. And Yeltsin said, yet that doesn't make any sense. Russia is very, very big and NATO is quite small. The last time I know of that there was any sort of serious discussion in the US government was in 2001. This was after Putin had been talking about, well, maybe Russia should join NATO. Richard Haas, the director of policy planning, sent a memo forward to Secretary Powell that had been drafted by Angela Stent, who was then on the staff, titled Why NATO Should Invite Russia to Join. And Haas later reflected, having Russia inside NATO was a big idea. NATO had become a set of discretionary relations, and having Russia closer to NATO is not inconsistent with what Russia has become, or with what NATO has become. Also, maybe worth noting, 2002, former Secretary of State James Baker published a piece in the Washington Quarterly titled "Russia in NATO?" In which he argued that the door should be open to a democratic Russia. And he wrote in that piece that Gorbachev raised the possibility of the Soviet Union joining 3 times in 1990 during the course of the discussions on German unity. In terms of the benefits and costs, benefits, of course, of inviting Russia to join is that Russia would have had no reason to fear enlargement. And the costs would have included the possible disruption of NATO operations, the long border with China, and the really expanded NATO security burdens. And I think, if you build on Haas's premise, I think what you'd have to argue if Russia were to have joined NATO, would have been a completely different institution. It would have had a very different purpose. We could argue whether that would have improved. There's diminished security in Europe. Certainly hard to imagine how Vladimir Putin, if Russia were currently a member of NATO, how that would be with Putin. It seems like that would be rather disruptive, but I think it should be considered as one of the alternatives because it was discussed. And then the one that I think is probably the most important is the question of some enlargement, but not as much as. And it's important to remember NATO enlargement was not just one decision. There was a decision in 1997 to invite 3, not 5, to join NATO in the first round, which occurred, the 3 joined in March of 1999. There was a decision to invite 7 more countries, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which joined in 2004. And there was the decision at the Bucharest summit in 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest, to declare that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And I think that statement in particular was highly problematic. At that time, NATO was called membership action plans for countries. And what happened at Bucharest was that the Bush administration wanted to put Ukraine and Georgia on membership action plans. The French and Germans said no. And the compromise was the state Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, which my view of the worst of all worlds because it prejudged the outcome of a membership action plan process. You're supposed to judge the countries at the end, not before they're on it. And it gave neither country an actual path to join. So, and I think what's really important to note about that statement, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, is that because it was the consensus language at NATO, and you would need a new consensus to have new language, that was then the consensus language repeated at every NATO summit, at every meeting of the NATO Secretary General with the Ukrainians. Every time there was a comment, this was the language that was repeated. So it's not like it was just repeated in 2008 and then you just forget about it. It's stated over and over. I think if you, I highly recommend the book Back Channel by Bill Burns, his memoir. I think he really makes a very strong case in his memoirs that the Russians had accommodated themselves to the first 2 rounds of NATO enlargement. They didn't like the 99 round. They didn't like the 2004 round, especially with the Baltics coming in. But that the 2008 statement was unnecessarily provocative. And if you look, the Back Channel, Burns has a website. There's a website on the Carnegie Endowment website, still there, even though he's now left Carnegie Endowment for the CIA. But he has his memos cables he wrote home when he was ambassador in Moscow in that period. And, you know, he was saying to the Bush administration, this is just, don't do this. It crosses a red line in Moscow. So I think we have to consider whether a more selective approach to enlargement would have been a better path than the path chosen. My co-editor, Shifrinson, for example, would tell you that, you know, we should not have included the Baltics in the 2004 enlargement. That was unnecessarily provocative for the Russians. I don't agree with that. But he and I do agree with that it was mistaken to do the 2008 state. And it would have meant one fewer reason for antagonism in the relationship. You know, a lot of people draw a line between what happened in Bucharest in 2008 and what happened between Russia and Georgia in August of that year. April statement, August war. Worth noting, February 2008, Kosovo declared its independence, and Putin told the Georgian president, Saakashvili, we need to pay the West back for that, and you're going to be part of it. So, and I think that gets into the broader question of how to disentangle enlargement and the impact of enlargement on the U.S.-Russia relationship or the West relationship with Russia from other issues that I would argue were even more important. The cost of selective engagement, there would have been uncertainty over U.S. and NATO intentions that might have triggered miscalculations from the Russians, and one could argue that that's what occurred in February of 2022 because Ukraine wasn't on the path to join NATO. I think that's worth discussing, and certainly there would have been questions raised about what Article 10 meant, what NATO considers to be Europe, that I think also is important. So let me just briefly talk about the present. So I mentioned I posed and wrote in fact, Ivo Dalder, who became ambassador to NATO the following year in April 2008, we wrote a piece right after the summit, arguing that this was the worst of all worlds. So why now, 15 years later, do I believe that NATO should invite Ukraine to join the alliance? My view is that the primary challenge to European security is Russian imperialism, the unwillingness of Russia to live within its 1991 internationally recognized borders. That is the main security challenge for the Europeans, due to the instability that it creates up and down Eastern Europe. The concern that I had in 2008 about provoking Putin, to me, my mind, is no longer relevant. He launched a full-scale invasion in February of 2022 without any provocation whatsoever. And I think the big challenge for Ukraine and therefore for Europe going forward is how do you best deter military attacks against Ukraine over the long term? And I don't see any alternative to that other than bringing Ukraine into NATO. I don't see how you solve this problem of the continual threat that Russia poses to Ukraine. We know Putin is deterred by NATO because we've seen it in this war. The logical thing to have done when you're on the road to 300,000 casualties on the Russian side would have been to bomb the supply lines coming in from Poland, for example. Putin doesn't want a NATO-Russia war any more than Joe Biden wants a NATO-Russia war, and I think that that's been an important feature of these past 2 years. The cost of bringing Ukraine into NATO are, the additional security burdens on NATO, the potential as a flashpoint between NATO and Russia. But to my mind, the benefits of creating a real deterrent to future Russian military action outweigh the costs. But again, as I did the first set of issues related to NATO enlargement, got to compare it to the alternative. If you look at some of the alternatives being discussed, there for a while in summer and fall of 2022, the U.S. administration was talking about the Israel model. I don't know whether they use the term anymore, but the idea was that you provide a security commitment to Ukraine to provide it with sufficient military assistance to give it a qualitative military edge over Russians, but no security guarantee. You're not going to come to their defense. You're going to provide them with the wherewithal to defend themselves. Benefits of the approach: no Article 5 guarantee has to be upheld. But I think the costs are that because of that, you have less of a deterrent to future Russian aggression. You also have the question about whether or not it's feasible. If you think about the Israel model, there's two features of the Israel model that I felt when this was discussed in summer, fall 2022 and after were important and still are. Israel has a nuclear deterrent, which Ukraine does not. So, are you thinking that Ukraine should pursue a nuclear weapon capability? And second, Israel has, at least to date, been the recipient of strong bipartisan support for assistance for 50 years. And it's very difficult to imagine that in the case of Ukraine. Second, there's been a lot of discussion of another alternative recently, and that's bilateral security guarantees from the US and other major Western powers. And in part, that's because of the challenge of getting NATO to ratify Ukrainian accession and the timetable. And, Sweden's controversial. Ukraine would be more controversial. Sweden's not really controversial. They're just caught up in Turkey trying to get airplanes. In terms of the, I'm going to come back to this issue of the bilateral security guarantees because I think it could be a way station with Ukraine joining down the road. It would be better than nothing. I don't think it's as good as having the NATO guarantee, but I think it's better. I think having security guarantees is better than having no security. A third alternative, presumably, is Ukrainian declaration of neutrality in exchange for a Russian promise not to invade again. I don't know what that Russian promise would mean. I don't know how Ukraine could agree to it. Who's going to monitor it? Certainly would be less of a security burden, but doesn't provide much of a guarantee that Russia won't violate it in the future. So I don't see the advantage. The challenging question, and I'll close with this. The challenging question for what you do with respect to Ukraine over the long term, obviously this war is still going on and it's going to go on for a while, but how do you create a different dynamic where you don't have the constant threat of a Russian invasion? As I said, I would love to see Ukraine be put on the path to NATO membership. This U.S. administration has made very clear that's not happening. There's not going to be an invitation at the July summit in Washington. Bilateral commitments could be given, particularly since once a country is invited, it takes a while even for them to join, and it doesn't have a security guarantee. The difference between Finland and Sweden is instructive. Finland has an Article 5 guarantee. Sweden no. And I just want to give a shout out to Steve Pfeiffer because I think he's written a really interesting piece arguing that given that there's not going to be an invitation, but given he also believed Ukraine needs to be put on a path that what NATO could do at the July summit is open accession talks with the Ukrainians, put off the issue of an invitation down the road, but at least to get the ball rolling on that accession. Whatever we do, in my view, as we look back at the past series of decisions or as we think about the future policy choices, again, I don't think we can just say we support or oppose a particular policy, but that we have to consider the plausible alternative and try to weigh the costs and benefits. All policies have costs and benefits. All reasonable policies have costs and benefits. So you can't just argue one is great and the other stupid, as has been done in the NATO enlargement debate for quite some time. And my hope is that this book will at least help improve the debate over what has been a hugely consequential policy and may continue to be hugely consequential in the years to come. So I look forward to any questions or comments that you might have. Thanks.
As always, the first question goes to a fellow.
Josh Blahnik, visiting scholar here. Thanks so much for the talk. Really fascinating. I have a question about Ukraine. You favor a path to NATO membership for Ukraine, but this, of course, presupposes an outcome of the conflict where Ukraine maintains its sovereignty and can establish the conditions to join NATO. But given the state of the conflict today, it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime in the near future. So is this just sort of, well down the road, if the conditions present themselves, this is the path we should take? Or is there any implication for what we should be doing today different from our current policy towards war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, it's a hard question to answer because there's two issues with respect to the current war. One is, will there be an end to the war? I think the expectation is within Ukraine and within Russia is to go on for a long time to come, even if there's fatigue in the West and that affects the debate over the aid policies. I think it could go on for a long time to come. And as you're saying, the problem for people who are arguing, like I do, for Ukrainian membership in NATO, you at least have to know where Ukraine is, what the Ukraine is that you are defending, right? And for example, protecting from these attacks on civilian targets within Ukraine. And so, and will that happen short of some end to the war? It may not, right? So then the second question was, if there is an end to the war, what does that end to the war look like? Is it sort of a Korea-style armistice where there's no negotiated treaty? Is there a negotiated treaty? Which would be really difficult, right? And a treaty in which you have the Russians, you have President Putin actually interested in negotiation, and the Ukrainians being willing to agree to the loss of territory, right? When they know what happens on Russian occupied territory. Certainly the conditions aren't right now. I think it's interesting that, the two models that you see discussed with respect to this question are the Japan model and the West German model. The U.S. treaty with Japan is with respect to the territory under the administrative control over that Japan, under the territory that Japan has administrative control over. So, for example, the disputed territory with Russia is not part of the U.S.-Japan defense treaty. And then there's a West German model where you have West Germany come in, even though there is territory in Eastern Germany that was not accepted as, forever and ever, that this would, never be part of a united Germany. And of course, NATO only covered the territory of the then West Germany and then included the rest when it was possible to do that so many decades later. And when I talk about Ukrainian membership in NATO, I am thinking about a situation in which there is at least some recognition of an end to the war and an understanding of what the borders of that sovereign and independent Ukraine are, and that would be then covered by some kind of security guarantee. Whether it's the Article 5 under NATO or whether it's bilateral security guarantees, clearly the latter are more possible. But again, for a long term, if there's an end to the war, how do you keep this from happening again and again and again? I just don't know any way other than Ukraine coming into NATO.
one of the 16,000 downloads. We're going to read several chapters in the class I'm teaching on contemporary Russia this quarter. So I wanted to I know you've read and know the book by Mary Sarati pretty well, and also since you've been thinking about this for a long time, one of the excuses or reasons Putin gives for having gone into Ukraine twice, not once but twice, of course, is NATO enlargement, as you said. But also he points to this alleged promise that was made by Jim Baker, not 1 inch after Germany reunifies. And so I've been reading the Zuboff book that came out also, looking at trying to sort of discern some points of no return, or I guess sort of punctuated equilibrium where if a different decision had been made, maybe we wouldn't be where we are now, a different decision 40 years ago. So was that, how do you square the not 1 inch thing? I know it wasn't an official promise, right? It was just an idea that was floated, and Gorbachev kind of jumped on it and has been ambiguous. That's one. And then second, with respect to 2008, I mean, that does seem like a mistake on the part of George W. Bush. And is the issue really that, the ambiguity that we left Ukraine with? And that's actually, ironically, what provoked Putin by 2022. That is, we should have made a firm decision on a cession after 2008 with Georgia and Ukraine.
Thanks. Thanks for using this for the class. My big hope, because you have these different chapters on the West relationship with Russia, U.S. Russia, that you have these different perspectives. And I should give a plug, because I often do. I think the chapter that Kim Martin wrote for this book is the best thing that's ever been written. I mean, it's just really phenomenal on looking a deep dive on the Russian military's reaction to enlargement, which he argues they recognize enlargement, which I would argue is also demonstrated by the fact that Putin moved all those troops from the north down to Ukraine, left the border wide open in the north because he knows NATO not going to. But anyway, that's not what you asked. Okay, so one is this issue about whether a promise was made by the United States in 1990, which my co-editor has also written about. Shifrinson has also written about the promise question, where in February of 1990, Secretary of State Baker was meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow, and there was this comment, NATO's jurisdiction should not extend 1 inch to the east. I agree. Huge debates about what they could have been, were they just discussing Germany? And in fact, in the Treaty on German Unification, you had some limitation on what NATO could do in what had been East Germany. Did it mean something broader? Those of us who argue, I mean, my view on the promise is I think it's a distraction, partly because you had a negotiation over German unification. That was a discussion at the beginning of the negotiation. Could Gorbachev have pushed that point as the negotiations went on? I think he could have pushed it. My view is what he most wanted was cash. And that's what he got. He got a lot of cash in that, not for himself, but for the country. In those negotiations. I mean, the Germans provided a significant amount of assistance. That's what he wanted. And so he didn't pursue this. The problem is, of course, a lot of the Russians did, hear this. And it wasn't just the US thing. German Foreign Minister, then West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher was also saying similar things. So, these are signals that former or later, at the time, member of the Supreme Soviet, later Russian Foreign Minister, later Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, in his memoirs, says we should have gotten this written into the treaty. So I have two things that I have in responses. One is that one of the things I've written about is that I view a discussion that took place in October of 1993 between Warren Christopher and Boris Yeltsin, relaying to Boris Yeltsin that NATO was going to be pursuing partnership for peace at the upcoming NATO summit. And not, I mean, that's what they were going to be pursuing, and that they weren't going to be doing enlargement at the summit. They weren't going to have associate membership status for countries or anything like that. I view that as much more important because it was a conversation that was taking place between the two administrations, the Clinton and the Yeltsin, under which enlargement took place. I mean, the discussion between H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, you know, they were both gone from the scene before the action really took place. And I think people really need to pay more attention to that conversation about what partnership for peace meant. And Yeltsin's reaction, huge relief that, you know, tell Bill it's brilliant. I mean, just huge relief that NATO enlargement wasn't moving forward. That was October 93. In September 94, Clinton told him, actually, NATO enlargement is going to be moving forward. So I think that conversation is important. The other thing I would say is I do think that the West, and particularly the United States, did provide a set of security assurances to the Russians that I believe the West felt that it upheld. The assurances were, we will not take measures that undermine your security as you retreat from Europe. So what did the West do as the Russians retreated from Europe? You know, agreements on conventional forces in Europe, huge drawdown of US forces in Europe. I mean, huge drawdown of US forces in Europe to try to allay these concerns. The Partnership for Peace, then including Russia in the Partnership for Peace, including Russia in the Dayton Peace Accords that were signed at the end when Dayton was signed, in the implementation force after Dayton was signed in November of 1995. The NATO-Russia Founding Act with a number of provisions there in 1997. I think from the West standpoint, it was basically, we said we wouldn't do things to undermine your security, and we're taking steps to demonstrate. And the Russians looked and said, but NATO's coming closer and closer and closer. So you did violate. And I think I mean, those are different perspectives. I don't think you can bridge those perspectives. And I just think I think the West felt that it was doing the things that it assured Russia it would do, and the Russians said, we don't like NATO enlargement. But 2008, I mean, it's, you know, it's what's interesting is do we judge 2008 through the lens of 2022? Or do we judge it from where we were at the time? I mean, the reason I was opposed at the time was I thought, you know, why are we doing such an in your face move towards Putin when we're not serious about bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO? It's all provocation with no action. You know, you look at it from the standpoint of February 22, and then you're like, oh my God. I mean, maybe the Bush administration was right. Like, we should have put him on an action plan and gotten him into NATO, and then he wouldn't have had the attack. But I try to judge it from where we were at the time, and so that's why I thought it was a mistake, and I continued to argue that over the years.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm a visiting scholar here at CSAC. I just wanted to probe you a little bit more on your argument about the benefits of NATO enlargement, where you spoke about political and economic reforms in Eastern Europe and EU enlargement. And you said that you don't think EU enlargement would have been possible without NATO enlargement. I just wanted to know if the aim was political and economic reform. That is exactly what the EU as well also prescribed for membership. So why was the NATO membership so significant for the EU membership?
Yeah, super important question. And actually, there is a great chapter in this book by assistant professor at Texas A&M, Alex Chinchilla, and her former professor at University of Chicago, Paul Post, in which they try to disentangle the impacts of NATO and EU enlargement on democratic and economic reform in Central and Eastern Europe, and they make the case that EU enlargement was far more important for the political and economic reform that took place than NATO. So that's it's important to mention. It's an excellent piece. What they don't address, which I would, is that the issue of the EU being willing to enlarge the countries that were not under the NATO security umbrella in Central and Eastern Europe. Well, no, because I think that the concern was, well, how can we bring in countries that might be the subject or object of Russian aggression? We're much more comfortable bringing them in if we know that they're covered by the NATO security guarantee and that the United States is there backing up that Article 5 guarantee, which, the United States isn't a member of the European Union. It's also the case that former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl did say to Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, we could not have pursued EU enlargement if those countries weren't coming in. So I mean, I don't just take it because Helmut Kohl said it, but it is worth noting a German chancellor saying it to an American Deputy Secretary of State or former Deputy Secretary of State by that point. But this is certainly a very contentious point because there are a lot of people who would argue that EU enlargement was the most important thing. You didn't need NATO to do this. And so that's how you would get the benefits of political and economic reform. I don't think you would have gotten the same sense of security and stability across the region. I thought you were going to ask about the failures of these institutions to ensure political and economic reform, especially with what has occurred in Hungary. But somebody can ask that if they want.
Somebody actually has asked that. Thinking of Hungary or perhaps Turkey, how do we know new NATO members will not someday become sympathetic to or prompted by Russia and paralyze decision making, which is what happens?
Yes. And I will say, as somebody who supported enlargement, both EU and NATO, I do believe that the 1990s me, it would never have occurred to me that these countries would adopt these reforms and become anchored in these institutions and then go in an authoritarian direction. Failure of imagination on my part, but I didn't see that coming. Of course, I didn't see what's happened here coming either. So, the US could become the most problematic country within NATO. I mean, make Hungary and Turkey look like, minor thing. Just two things I would say on that, though. One interesting, I was in a conversation, I was in a workshop probably 5 years ago or so, and there were a number of former Central and East European officials who were at the meeting in Washington who had been involved in their country's accession to NATO. And there were 3 very senior former Hungarian officials. And somebody asked them about the backslide. And their argument was, well, yes, there's backsliding, but think about how bad it would be if they weren't in the EU or NATO. We would just have full-blown fascism in Hungary. Okay, that was their. All right. Second thing I would point out is, if you look at both EU and NATO since the expanded war in February of 2022, there's been a remarkable ability of both institutions to act in support of Ukraine, despite the fact that you have these difficulties in the case of the EU, Hungary, and in the case of NATO, with both Hungary and Turkey. And of course, the big package. I mean, you had the big scene in December with the EU and the Hungarian willingness, at least to leave the room with the push forward on the session talk for Ukraine, but the decision not to support the package. And I think, the big problem, the big question about this is, co-optation by the Russians, or is it just, them, two leaders trying to get the most that they can get out of this process, right? What can Hungary extort from the EU in exchange for its support? What can Turkey extort from the US in exchange for support for Sweden coming into NATO? So, you've got two excellent extortionists. And of course, the relationship with Putin is a problem. But I do think we should remember how significant the NATO and EU actions have been despite this in the last 2 years.
That you took me down memory lane on a lot of this. You've studied the completeness. I lived it at the time. And one of the things that struck me then and in your talk was the importance of context, and what lessons can be drawn to subsequent rounds or episodes in this from a very different context. You referred to the political pressures on Clinton to expand, the Polish American, Czech American, which I remember as being very real, or accorded a lot of weight in there. There was the argument that EU membership would come very slowly, and it was an imperative to try and lock in more democratic institutions by giving them a role, and a role that you did make that point. Concerns about NATO falling apart is in the context of the Balkan Wars here. As part of the perceived or imagined or driven urgency here was, what do we do with NATO after the Cold War is over? Will it hold together? What is its purpose? Being at least a bigger part of it is which additional members should be in there. Where I'm going with this is not to challenge any of your analysis, because I'm sure it's better than my memory here. But the conditions in 2008, the conditions now and looking forward are very different. Lessons learned from the work that you've done. How much attention should we pay to the presidential debates and decision-making of a different time and different set of circumstances? And can we get to a clean piece of paper to look at the opportunities, the challenges, the cost, the benefit today?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's why I argue that what the views that I held in 2008, I just don't feel are relevant today. So my concerns in 2008 is this would be overly provocative to the Russians without any real benefit to the West. I'm just less focused on provoking Putin. The problem right now isn't provoking Putin. The problem right now is keeping Putin from pursuing the goals that he has. And I would just note on the political pressures, just a little fun fact that you might enjoy. So the Polish ambassador to the United States, who I spent a lot of time talking to when I was working on my NATO enlargement book from 1999, Jerzy Kosminski, in 1997, Ambassador Kosminski was super active in working with the Polish diaspora in the United States to try to generate pressure on the Clinton administration. And as part of the NATO enlargement debate, Senator Biden said, my constituents in Delaware couldn't care less about NATO enlargement. And Kosminski reached out to a Polish American on the Wilmington City Council, and there was a then proclamation by the Wilmington City Council in support of NATO enlargement. Fun little fact.
On that very cheerful note, probably the most cheerful note of the afternoon. Well, please join me in thanking Jim for a fantastic.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.